Kick things off today with an inspiring keynote from Bryan Lee of Co-Locate Design in New Orleans. Bryan is an architect, an educator, a writer, and design justice activist. He is the founding design principal of Co-Locate Design and a nonprofit multidisciplinary design practice in New Orleans, dedicated to expanding community access to design and creating spaces of racial, social, and cultural equity. He is a design critic at Harvard GSD and has led 2 award-winning youth community design programs. Bryan is a founding co-organizer of the DAP, Design as Protest Collective, and Dark Matter University. He was most recently honored as one of the 2018 Fast Company Most Creative People in Business, a USC Annenberg MacArthur Civic Media Fellow, and the youngest design firm to win the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award in 2019.
Okay, we can. Perfect. Okay, again, just wanted to kind of, again, say thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. I'm going to be short but brief, but hopefully something here connects to your story and the way that you're considering working in your environment. This presentation today is called Power in Place. Some of you have heard me speak before, and some of you haven't, but the intention here is really just to understand that all places, all power resides through land and its derivatives. And the way that we think about our work contributes to whether or not that land and its derivatives, buildings, minerals, crops, landscapes, are just or inequitable. And so this is just a way of analyzing and assessing what that might look like, and hopefully gearing you up to take action as you move forward. I often like to start with a little bit of a story from when I was young. My grew up in Trenton, New Jersey. My grandmother lived here in this house for about 20 years. I often talk to people about the fact that part of the emphasis on design justice is, can we honor the griot? Can we honor the people who have and hold the stories of place and make sure that their voice is invested in the act of city building, in the act of neighborhood building, in the act of block building? What does it mean for us to actually recognize that people like my grandmother spent 20, 30, 40 years on the block and know every single crack in the sidewalk, know every child who walked over that crack? They understand the space so well in a way that we as designers will never know. And so if we can get out of our way enough to honor the PhDs of the block and allow them to influence the way that we interpret and bring design to the world, we will be better off for it. My grandmother's one of those people, but those people exist on every block across the world. So that brings me to Co-Locate. So my grandmother was the impetus for me starting to think about being an architect, and ultimately to start this practice, Co-Locate, as well. Back when my mother was in the military, we lived in Sicily for about 3 years. Moving from Trenton to Sicily, I don't know if you've been to Sicily, I don't know if you've been to Trenton, but they are wildly different places. And the ability to know the difference between those two spaces was really keen on a 10-year-old's mind as we moved back from Sicily to the United States and back to Trenton into my grandmother's house. In that transaction, I started to understand the difference between those spaces. I started to understand the difference between walkability of place and the kind of sociability of space and place, and what it might mean for a city to be planned at a scale and an architecture to be planned at a scale that includes sociability as a primary consideration in the work. I asked my parents what that meant to design a space for my grandmother, a space that didn't isolate, that didn't harm her on a day-to-day basis. They said it was to be an architect. And so that's the path, that's the journey that I went on. In 2017, after many years of struggle and just aging, my grandmother passed. I was working for the city at the time, and I decided, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to actually sit and do administrative work in the way that I was doing it. Even though I love my job, I said, I'm going to take a gambit and start out and create a practice that was based on the original principles of the work that I wanted to do to support my grandmother in that moment. And what that meant was that we started a practice that was focused on the kind of colloquial, on the sophisticatedly informal use of formal language based in place. So for us, co-locate is just colloquial and locate. It is about the informal language, informal design language of place. And if we can harness that, if we can lean into that, we can create better spaces for those who exist within those environments. And then on top of that, the bonus, the cherry on top, is that the word co-locate in and of itself talks about the habitual juxtaposition of words and phrases at a greater frequency than chance. And so our practice seeks to understand the sequence of people and place habitually juxtaposed at a greater frequency than chance. It is necessary and essential to understand those relationships and to build on those relationships in order for us to create an architecture that serves those who have been disinherited from the process of block building and neighborhood building. So essential to that conversation is one that speaks to power, values, and care. We have to, again, acknowledge that in our work, especially through the design justice lens, if we acknowledge these 3 points and then delve deeper into each of them, we will do justice to the not just the clients that we have, but the constituents that use the spaces we are designing. The recognition that power is the sum of all the history of all revolutions is based in blood and land. It's based in that power. It's based in the relationship between the landless and the landlord. Right? It's based in, again, an understanding that land and its derivatives shape so much of what power looks like, whether it's our political maps, whether it's our state lines, our borders, property ownership, segregation, separation. All of these things have land and building-based considerations bound to them. Second thing is values. Our collective values are validated through the spaces and places that we design. And so in harmful and racist, in biased systems, we create monuments to the hubris of that supremacy through the built environment. And so our ability to recognize what our values are is truly important in how we move forward. And sometimes it's hard in the face of clients who may not want to align with those values or may not have the same values as those who are utilizing a space over time. But our job then is to be able to translate, convince, and be a conduit for the people as much as possible. When I say our job, ours as a practice, and I hope potentially maybe yours in the future as you start to practice moving forward. The third thing is care. So design justice is what love looks like in public spaces. It is really a deep reflection and projection of care for a beloved community expressed in physical form. And what that means is that we are talking about the ability to be in a beloved community requires us to be in community in moments where it's not transactional, in moments where it is truly about service. How do we care? How do we show up when it's not about the architecture, when it's just about our humanities kind of intermingled, right? The more we're able to do that, the more we're able to be in community, the better our work will be down the line. Because design moves at the speed of trust. It moves, especially in marginalized communities, especially in communities that have been disinherited from the process of designing their space and that self-determination. If we don't have trust, we continually build spaces that are harming those communities. And so all of that sums up to this core idea that for nearly every injustice in the world, there was an architecture, a plan, a design that is built to sustain it. And so design justice has to forward a radically anti-racist, liberatory vision for racial, social, and cultural reparation through the process and outcomes of design. I say radical because, oftentimes people are scared of the word radical, but radical really just means, the etymology is radish. It just talks about getting to the root of an issue. And what are we if we're not designed and built and crafted as architects to get to the root of an issue? Sometimes we're just missing what that root is. We're getting to the root of issues for clients, maybe not for the communities we're serving. And so the job here is to get to the root of an issue before we start to propose solutions. in that vein. Again, acknowledging racial, social, and cultural reparation. Now, reparation really just means to heal. Can we be transformative in the work? We know that the act of architecture in any space is one that causes some version of harm. It just does, because it changes the landscape of a particular community. And the mitigation of that, the mitigation of even harms that we did not cause, the lasting effect of decisions made by folks prior to us coming into being, lives in our decision making, lives in the memory of the city, lives in the memory of the neighbors, and our ability to recognize that our building is not the end all be all, cannot solve all past issues, but can act in a reparative way is essential. And that acting in a reparative way requires us to consider not just the outcomes, not just the pretty building, but the process and the outcomes. How we get to that outcome, how we get to that end is essential as well. And then out of that, we talk about the fact that design justice seeks to challenge privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool for oppression. Whether people explicitly note that the spaces and places they're designing are going to cause harm, like the Charles Munger building that we've seen all over the internet in the last few days, in the last week or so, that is a building explicitly going to harm people. Right. And our job then is to not be complicit in that, to challenge those situations, because money should not dictate who gets justice or who gets some act of care in the built environment. So all of these issues, whether they're rooted in housing or transportation or economic injustice, have some land and building-based considerations. And our job here is not to try to take on all of these issues as a profession, but it is to play our role, to be a part of the Avengers, to be a part of the organizations that are leading the way towards a just and fair and liberatory environment. And so what that means in practice, because I think a lot of people ask me, okay, that's all fine and dandy. I'm glad that you have a direction that seems to be based on justice, but what does that mean in practice? How do we actually change, or what is different? So there's a couple things, and we'll talk about a little bit more of them as we move forward. But the intention really is just to make sure that we're bringing communities in at the very beginning of a project, all the way through a project. We do not isolate an outreach or an organizing effort. We do not frame the project through the experience or the extractive data that we need. We frame the projects through the needs of the community. And that means that they are involved consistently and throughout. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like as we move forward. Generally, we're then asking everyone in the process to commit to a few things, the principles of practice, to think about how we honor the griot. I had mentioned this as the first thing when I first came on, but recognizing then that land is liberation, that we can build power in the places and spaces that we exist, that we acknowledge that culture is evolution and culture is revolution. Culture is the sum of so many consequential experiences that shape the patterns, habits, and routines of community members over a long period of time. But also culture changes on the dime if there is enough energy, enough force to change the way we operate. And so we're seeing culture shifts all the time in our society, and we have to kind of acknowledge those in the way that we think about what design looks like moving forward. Can we commit to being radical? And really just the question is, can we commit to getting to the root of an issue before trying to solve that issue? Can we imagine what a just future might look like, or recognize that form follows fiction, especially in communities that have been marginalized over time? It's often that we haven't had the opportunity to build and shape our neighborhoods from a position of self-determination. We are often relegated to using spaces that were not built for us, but we have to shape. And so we build our stories in places that don't necessarily resemble or reflect our story, our history, but we make that work. And so when we talk about form follows fiction, form follows the narratives, the stories that people tell, that they hold in their minds, not necessarily in place, but they are attached to a place. right? It's not maybe not the architecture that you would lean into, but it definitely is the experience that you would want to hold on to. And because we don't value some spaces, we also knock down a lot of the spaces that are important to communities of color, communities of culture. And then lastly, design is protest. To protest is to have an unyielding faith in the power and potential of a just society. And design in that frame allows us to think about what a future might look like when we win the battles that we are facing relative to justice and liberation in the built environment. Now, that means that we work to ask ourselves these core questions. Who holds power in our particular communities? What are the injustices that exist? Who is directly and disproportionately impacted? How does it manifest in our built environment? And then ultimately, what modes, what opportunities do we have as a community, as a practice, as individuals to challenge systems and to reveal what it might look like for a world on the other side of some of these issues? It requires us to acknowledge in practice that we have to move out of a sense of just outreach in our projects, which is one that is bound by the compression of time of work schedules. Oftentimes, outreach is simply the communication that we give to our surrounding neighbors in a project. Recognizing that we have an obligation to one another extends beyond outreach. It extends beyond a monologue of communication. It sometimes extends into engagement. Engagement is really just communication with a feedback loop, a loop that starts to allow for communities to express their feelings into a project. But we ask people to push one step further. And in our practice, we don't always get there, but our intention is always to move one step further into organizing. And by doing so, we are strategically mobilizing and making sure that we build power through the work. What better way to build power in our communities, both political and social, than through building a building together, building spaces together, building experiences together. These are the opportunities that we have with every single building. Every single time we change our landscape, we can make our communities stronger, or we can tear them apart. It's our choice, and we have to be better at making the right one. And again, practically, as we do this, we understand that there are various ways to engage in this work that are not always in architecture, that are not always a final product of a building, but they are all interconnected. And the precedent we set in one ripples into everything else. And so the pedagogy we set that frames our ideology in this world, and that ideology that shifts and tells us what our policies should be as they get codified, and then the way that we implement those policies through procedure is extremely important. And all of these things are the signals that are being sent out to tell us every single day how we need to operate, how we should work in this world. And on the back end of that, there are the receivers, the practices that we all run, the projects that we do, the collectives of people that we organize or that we bring together. And our job from the receiver side is to receive these signals and to say, are we in line with the procedures or the policies that are being afforded to us, whether that's IBC, our local zoning, any other rule and regulation that starts to define the way that we operate in a space is extremely important. And so we can say, yes, we're good. We're going to operate this way, or we can say, no, this is not the way that we need to operate. We're actually going to challenge you to do better. We're going to challenge you to do better by this individual or this project or this community. And we can do that because the scale of the work allows us to kind of channel that power. Right. And so design professions as an institution have an imposed power like every other institution. And so if we're not careful, we can be conduits to malicious sources of power. And we don't have to be. We can stand up in those meetings and we can say that either we're not doing a particular type of work or that something should be changed in order to have better outcomes for the communities that we are a part of. It requires us to understand that if we're changing policies and procedures, we're seeking something bigger and broader. We're moving from levels of injustice that we know and sometimes feel like we don't have the ability to change or alter in any way, to one of equity and justice and liberation long term, to move from status quo, which is what we do on a daily basis, to equality, which just simply affirms a fairness moving forward, all the way down to what we talk about relative to justice, which says, can we repair for past injustices in the built environment? Can we present fairness in the moment? And can we remove barriers to progress moving forward? Is that possible? And is it possible even to take it one step further to liberation and start to affirmatively influence the future outcomes of those who have been harmed through space, whether it was our space or not? Can we act in that manner? Can we give grace in that manner towards a series of opportunities in the built environment that seek liberation for those who have been harmed? All of that requires us to understand the differences in race, in culture, in class, and ethnicity, all of these things that we use somewhat metaphorically across the board need to be parsed out and to be recognized and taught. Right? We don't actually teach and learn these things. And so we make poor decisions over and over and over again because we use race as a signifier for culture, or culture as a signifier for class. And those things are not always true, right? And so I ask you to think about the way culture is formed. And ultimately, our work leans on culture as the defining and driving mechanism by which we articulate an architecture. It is a recognition that the prevailing environmental, geographic, social kind of forces that exist, political forces that exist in a world, again, shape the patterns and routines of people within space, right? And those patterns and routines shift and move and create a tendency, a set of tendencies for a collective of people, right? So policies in the post-Reconstruction said that there are sundown towns, right? Well, Black people in those sundown towns changed how they operated because of that. And so as a culture, we started to move in different ways. I had a professor once tell me that as he was doing research in the South in the 60s, he noticed that 80% of the white families went through the front door, and he noticed that 80% of the Black families went through the side and rear door. And we began to have a conversation, but ultimately that conversation led to an acknowledgement that most people, especially Black and brown people, who, especially enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, had to go through the rear or side door of their house to move forward. And so that culture or that pattern and routine shaped and moved us into a future or to a present that we see today. And so those remnants still last in us. And whether we're trying to change those prevailing conditions and create new conditions, or if we're trying to understand the kind of logic of the isms or the biases that we extend in our built environment, we really, really have this opportunity to be clear about all of these details and to bring them into our work on a daily basis. It means that we can be anti-racist in this work, that we can think about design justice, and that we can practice from a position of liberation. That means ultimately, every time, if there's only one thing that you take from this presentation, think about the fact that if you want to think through liberatory praxis, then we are ultimately asking you to understand the narrative of place, understanding and acknowledge the people, the representation of those people, the indigenous, the Black, the immigrant, and the like, to acknowledge the mutuality of architecture. Architecture is not a singular endeavor that doesn't respond to or engage with its environment. It has to. It has to be accountable to the surrounding community. Can we deconstruct and construct new worlds? Can we deconstruct the systems of supremacy and harm and construct new worlds that are fairer and freer for more people? And can we future set? Can we think about an architecture that frames a future that exists on the other side of those harms, on the other side of injustice or inequity? And I can share some of these slides later if anybody wants to read them. And so lastly, as I'll close out here, a recognition that, again, there is a long history of conflating our stories and our histories, whether it's, again, as I mentioned, through color, race, nationality, ethnicity, and culture, but holding on to culture as the consequence of persistent collective circumstance and immediate conditions allows us to recognize that culture is not a superficial condition. It is one that is deeply defined and deeply inherited over time. And that shapes the way that we understand our history. And so when we understand that the history of the Black codes or the end of Reconstruction, Plessy versus Ferguson, Bauhaus movements extracting the kind of cultural frameworks of an architecture to get down to its core essential considerations, all the way to the Federal Housing Authority in 1937, Euclid versus Ambler, the suburbanization of outer cities in Levittown. We talk about the Federal Highways Acts in the 50s, all of these things, all the way down to CEPTED and the gutting of HUD in the 80s, shape the way that certain people have to move through certain spaces. That is how culture often is formed. It is the response, it is the survival mechanism that people have in the face of forces that are built to be antithetical to their existence. And so lastly, I'll just implore you to understand that it may not look like it used to, right? It may not mean that the people shouting others down or the colored entrance signs, they may not be still in existence, but the architecture that we build collects and holds the values of place. And if we're present and considerate of that work, then we can actually be a little bit more deliberate in what our outputs are. Revolutions happen through the claiming in space. So I ask of you to be a part of a revolution of justice in the built environment, to consider what it might mean for us to support and acknowledge those histories and move forward. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. And this is going to be a great conference. All right.
Let's see. Thank you so much, Bryan. It's nice to see you. And that was great. And you give us a lot to think about. And I just, want to thank you for your tireless advocacy on behalf of Design Justice. You're doing fantastic work. And I used to live down in New Orleans for only 4 years. I miss it. Tell everyone I said hi.
I will.
But I mean, your reputation down there and the hard work you and your firm are doing, I mean, it's just really great work. A lot for us to think about. And this is not a quick question, but, unlike most firms, your client is actually the community. It's not, so-and-so, developer, or it's not, hotel chain or what have you.
Yeah.
What are some of the challenges when your client is the community? What are some of the challenges that and you're kind of smiling there a little bit, what do you face with your community as a client?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you work with community proper, you have so many voices and a process to make sure that you're able to account for those voices and be accountable to those voices is difficult to create. And everyone needs to create that on their own kind of accord, how they operate, how they manage those relationships. And so for us, the most difficult part is to make sure that if we're talking to thousands of people within a community or hundreds of thousands of people, how do we capture those qualitative stories and those narratives, and then actively be able to represent that and present that back into the world in the kind of opposite condition when we've worked with one developer in our time, and it's very consolidated, it's very narrow. The decisions that are made by the developer in response to the client oftentimes is one or two options, right? The options are based on a financial consideration first and foremost, and the output secondarily, right? And so the communities, the recognition that the decisions are based on social fabric, social connection, cultural capital, and social capital are extremely important, right? And so that's the biggest difference, is that the type of capital that one is trying to build through the architecture that's placed is wildly different. Social capital and cultural capital from community, that's what they want to build, regardless of cost. Sometimes that needs to be adjusted, but that is what it is. And financial capital first and foremost for developers in general, like clients who are putting buildings into the world. So.
Well, thank you. And what project are you currently working on? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we are. So a project that we first started off with in terms of kind of visioning and trying to raise money for the Claiborne Innovation District here in New Orleans, which is a 19-block marketplace that threads the Treme, which was bifurcated by a highway in 1960s. So that's a huge one. The other one, we have 2 libraries that we're working on in Portland. Our Portland studio is growing, and we have a 25,000 square foot library in Northeast Portland that is steadily pacing. So a lot more, but again, those are the ones that are really interesting at the moment, because they are using. While I just quickly, the reason that I pinpoint those 2 is because we offer, and I'll say one more, which is Trinity Park Conservancy in Dallas, which is a transformative justice center and space. All 3 of those use what we call community design advocates. So community design advocates are members from the community who are community members, activists, organizers, and general advocates. And they join the design team and help us kind of translate, to work, to organize. And so for the project in Dallas, hiring formerly incarcerated people to be a part of our design team is extremely important for the project. In Portland, hiring people who are directly adjacent, the kind of second language learners who are a part of this specific community that's growing in a beautiful way in Portland has been really wonderful. And we're hiring 10 to 15 people who are not architects, but have a spatial experience that is valuable. And to honor that experience is extremely important. We're paying them, and they become, again, a consistent part of the team. Same can be said for the project we're doing here in the Treme here in New Orleans. So all is well, and thank you again.
Hiring locally, that is awesome. And people that have known that neighborhood for many years. I mean, their experience, their livelihood is invaluable to you, probably, with the work you're doing. And are those projects on your website? Do you want to give a little shout out to your website?
Yeah, you can go to colocate.org. Not all of them are on the website yet. They're not there yet, but they are coming. So if you see anything, you'll start to see, if you go to the blog page, you'll start to see some of those things trickling in. But yeah, they're all moving forward.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And I may be down this winter, so I'll look you up.
Say hi to the office.
Yes, I would love to. And we really appreciate your time. And again, go to Bryan Lee's website. Also, this will be recorded today, and it will be posted on our website later today because there was a lot to take from your presentation. So I hope everyone goes back to that. I know I will be. So thanks again. Take care.
Right, appreciate it. Shout out Mike Rogers and Brian Hudson. What's up?
All right. Yes.
All right, be safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye.